An 84-year-old woman vanishes without a single trace. It is the chilling realization of how quickly a standard forensic investigative procedure can be. She painted a picture of a guilty man whose timeline was falling apart under the pressure of a police investigation. The impact of that single broadcast was immediate and utterly catastrophic for the Guthrie family. Millions of viewers sitting in their living rooms nodded in agreement, entirely convinced that the tragic mystery had already been solved. The true crime community online erupted into a frenzy of speculation, dissecting every single frame of the news report and condemning Tommaso without a single piece of actual confirmed evidence. The media had successfully found its villain, and the narrative was far too juicy to ignore. It was the perfect story of family betrayal and hidden darkness. The intense public pressure shifted entirely from finding a missing elderly woman to demanding the immediate arrest of the son-in-law. The outrage was palpable, and the digital harassment directed at the family reached dangerous, unprecedented levels. But amidst all the screaming headlines and the confident declarations on national television, a massive and terrifying blind spot was intentionally ignored, aggressively twisted into a weapon of mass character assassination by people desperate for ratings. Not a single person sitting at those shiny news desks stopped to ask a fundamental forensic question: why was the car actually taken? The media eagerly presented the seized vehicle as the ultimate proof of a bloody crime scene hidden in the trunk. They weaponized a piece of unconfirmed information to generate massive ratings while a family was actively searching for their mother. The public accepted the false assumption without hesitation because it fit perfectly into the standard true crime script they were conditioned to consume. The journalists sold a story of guilt, but they were hiding a complex procedural truth that completely destroyed their lucrative narrative. The cameras kept rolling and the accusations kept flying while the actual detectives were doing something entirely different in the shadows. The media had their suspect, but the police had a crime scene that was telling a completely different story. Before we decode the actual forensic science behind taking that car and why the journalists were completely wrong, make sure you like this video to help the algorithm suggest it to others and help us spread the vital truth about the catastrophic dangers of media manipulation. We need to expose how easily the public can be brainwashed by a single broadcast. What exactly happens when the most damning piece of physical evidence paraded by the mainstream media is actually the absolute certainty in the voice of the television host left no room for nuance or actual legal procedure? The viewing public was manipulated into acting as the judge and jury based entirely on an anonymous tip and a tow truck. The devastation inflicted upon Tommaso was instantaneous and deeply vicious. He was trapped in a nightmare where his own face was broadcast as the symbol of a heinous crime. But the loudest voices in the room are rarely the most accurate. While the world screamed for his imprisonment, the silent work of the crime lab was preparing to unleash a massive shockwave that would completely shatter the media illusion. The absolute fury of the Guthrie family was immediate and entirely justified. Savannah Guthrie was reportedly livid over the reckless and completely unverified accusations hurled at her brother-in-law on national television. The family was already enduring the excruciating pain of a missing mother, and now a desperate attempt by law enforcement to prove a man's total innocence in the face of a violent unknown predator. We're being actively victimized by a parasitic media ecosystem hungry for a scapegoat. The anger was not just about the defamation of character. It was about the dangerous distraction it created. Every single minute the public spent obsessing over Tommaso was a minute completely wasted in the actual search for Nancy. To understand the sheer magnitude of the journalistic malpractice, we have to decode the actual forensic process that the media deliberately ignored. When law enforcement officers impound a vehicle belonging to the last person who saw a victim alive, it is very rarely a cinematic moment of discovering a murder weapon. In reality, it is an incredibly dry but absolutely essential procedure known as collecting exclusionary evidence. The crime scene investigators must establish a baseline of DNA and physical fibers. Because Tommaso drove Nancy home that night, his vehicle is naturally a critical point of contact. By seizing the car, the forensic team can meticulously vacuum the interior, swab the handles, and collect every single microscopic piece of data. We are about to tear apart the dangerous and deeply flawed illusion created by the national news cycle. They do this not to immediately prove he is a murderer, but to mathematically map out what normal looks like. If they find Nancy's hair in his car, it means nothing because she was a passenger. If they find his DNA on her coat, it is easily explained by their close proximity. Gathering this baseline data allows the laboratory technicians to filter out the innocent noise. Once they know exactly what Tommaso and his vehicle look like on a molecular level, they can confidently exclude those specific markers from the unknown evidence found at the actual crime scene. This process of elimination is the absolute bedrock of modern forensic science. You cannot identify a strange fingerprint until you have completely ruled out the fingerprints of everyone who actually lives in the house. The seizure of the car was not an indictment. It was a necessary step to clear the board. But the media willfully ignored this basic scientific reality because nuance does not generate high television ratings. Before we analyze the real reason law enforcement might hold on to a vehicle after they chose to broadcast a sensational lie rather than explain a complex legal procedure. The family was forced to release statements vehemently defending Tommaso while the journalists doubled down on their anonymous sources. The damage was done and the public narrative was poisoned. However, while the amateur internet sleuths and the high-paid podcasters were busy convicting an innocent man in the court of public opinion, the actual detectives were staring at something deeply terrifying. The forensic technicians were ignoring the noise on television and focusing entirely on the silent physical evidence left behind in the dark. Once the exclusionary baseline was successfully established using the family members and the vehicle, the crime lab began to isolate the anomalies. And what they found completely destroyed the media narrative in a single stroke. They were not looking at a domestic dispute gone wrong. The meticulous swabbing and vacuuming of the scene revealed the presence of something entirely foreign. Officially clearing a family. Make sure you subscribe to Seth's Crime Vault and hit the bell. The investigators found physical traces that absolutely did not belong to Tommaso Cioni. They found evidence that did not match Nancy Guthrie or anyone else in the immediate family tree. The biological markers and the physical disturbances pointed directly away from the son-in-law and toward a completely unknown entity. The police were quietly and methodically building a profile of an absolute stranger while the entire country was being trained to hate a grieving family member. The loud accusations on the evening news were completely out of sync with the microscopic reality sitting under the laboratory microscopes. The journalists had confidently built a massive house of cards using stolen terminology and fake authority. But the cold hard science was preparing to blow that house down. The detectives knew that the person they were looking for was not sitting in a television studio defending himself. The person they were actually hunting was a phantom who had slipped through the cracks while the media created a spectacular diversion. The real evidence was slowly spelling out a terrifying truth that no one on the outside was prepared to hear. We meticulously verify the actual court documents and cross-reference the physical evidence so you do not ever fall for the media manipulation that ruins innocent lives. The contrast between the screaming headlines and the silent, methodical work of the crime lab is the most chilling aspect of this entire investigation. The true monster was completely ignored by the cameras. The forensic team was staring at the actual fingerprint of a predator who had successfully utilized the chaotic media circus as the ultimate smokescreen to mask his escape into the dark Arizona night. The refusal to acknowledge the scientific reality created a deeply toxic environment around the ongoing search. Even as the crime lab quietly shifted their entire focus away from the relatives, the prominent broadcaster absolutely refused to walk back her sensational claims. She publicly doubled down, clinging desperately to her unnamed source despite the mounting evidence that the initial tip was completely baseless. This staggering display of journalistic arrogance effectively poured gasoline on an already raging digital fire. The viewing public, fueled by an insatiable appetite for familial scandal, continued to relentlessly attack the grieving relatives across every conceivable online platform. The online mobs tore apart photographs, analyzed micro expressions from press conferences, and bombarded the personal accounts of the victims' daughters with horrific accusations. The truth behind this disappearance is far more sinister than a simple domestic dispute. This relentless barrage of digital hatred forced the very people who were desperate to find their missing matriarch into a defensive crouch. Instead of organizing search parties or leaning on their community for critical, emotional support, they had to hire crisis managers and lawyers just to survive the public onslaught. The profound tragedy of this specific dynamic is that it actively and directly sabotages the actual police work. Law enforcement agencies rely heavily on community cooperation and clear tip lines to track down viable leads. But when a national network points a massive spotlight at an innocent man, the tip lines become completely paralyzed with useless noise. Hundreds of well-meaning but entirely misinformed citizens call in to report seeing the son-in-law looking suspicious, or to offer their own wild theories based on a primetime television segment. Every single one of those garbage tips must be officially logged, evaluated, and eventually dismissed by a detective. The sheer volume of this manufactured distraction drains incredibly limited resources, stealing precious hours away from the pursuit of the actual physical evidence. The sheer speed at which a grieving relative was transformed into a national pariah should terrify absolutely anyone who values the presumption of innocence. The investigators were forced to divide their attention between hunting a ghost in the physical world and managing a chaotic circus in the digital realm. It is a terrifying testament to how easily a false narrative can overwhelm the truth when it is amplified by a trusted voice. The emotional toll on the immediate household was absolutely immeasurable. Imagine waking up every single morning with the agonizing realization that your elderly mother is missing, potentially suffering, or worse. Then imagine turning on your phone only to see thousands of strangers actively accusing your husband or your brother of orchestrating her demise. The psychological pressure cooker created by this unique form of modern warfare is enough to break even the strongest individuals. The relatives were effectively trapped in a bizarre parallel universe where their actual trauma was completely ignored in favor of a highly dramatized and entirely fictitious storyline. The reporters camped out on their lawns were not looking for answers about the missing senior citizen. They were looking for a momentary lapse in composure, a single tear, or an angry shout that could be packaged into the next evening broadcast. The sheer callousness of the news cycle was staggering. The very last person to look her in the eyes is her own son-in-law. This case is a masterclass in how sensationalism actively destroys a legitimate criminal investigation. The authorities watched this unfold with growing frustration. They understood that the integrity of the prosecution could be compromised if the jury pool was hopelessly tainted by months of unchallenged defamatory broadcasts. The detectives were meticulously building a completely different puzzle, one that involved dark clothing, shattered glass, and foreign biology. Yet they were forced to constantly pause their vital work to extinguish the digital fires started by irresponsible commentators. The gap between what the television producers wanted to be true and what the microscopic evidence actually proved was widening by the minute. The tension was completely unsustainable. Something massive had to break, and the police knew they had to rip the microphone away from the pundits. If you believe that factual forensic evidence should always completely override the wild speculations of podcast hosts and television anchors, make sure you are subscribed to Seth's Crime Vault. We need your support to continue holding the sensationalist media entirely accountable for the damage they inflict on vulnerable families. The breaking point finally arrived on the 16th of February, 2026. The actual facts paint a completely different and far more horrifying picture of what happened that night. The local authorities decided they had seen absolutely enough of the destructive public spectacle. Sheriff Chris Nanos stepped in front of the microphones with a highly unusual and intensely definitive public mandate. In a move rarely seen in active missing persons investigations, the sheriff directly and aggressively addressed the rampant media speculation. He officially and completely cleared the entire family of any involvement in the disappearance. He did not mince his words or offer vague procedural updates. He explicitly labeled the ongoing rumors targeting the son-in-law and the extended relatives as entirely wrong and unimaginably cruel. This unprecedented public defense from the highest local law enforcement official was a massive blow to the highest television pundits who had built their entire weekly programming around the presumption of familial guilt. But the sheriff was not just there to scold the press, he was there to fundamentally rewrite the entire narrative of the case. With the relatives definitively removed from the suspect board, the authorities finally unveiled the terrifying reality they had been tracking in the dark. To understand how a family was completely torn apart by baseless accusations, we have to rewind to the mundane moments right before the chaos erupted. The investigative team released chilling details regarding the actual physical evidence recovered from the perimeter of the home. The focus dramatically shifted away from the impounded family vehicle and toward a completely shattered security camera located right near the front entrance. Investigators discovered jagged pieces of broken glass scattered across the ground, proving that someone had deliberately and violently blinded the technological eyes of the house right before the abduction occurred. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was a highly calculated tactical maneuver executed by someone who knew exactly how to dismantle a residential security perimeter. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. The police confirmed that before the camera was entirely destroyed, it managed to capture a fleeting but crucial glimpse of the true predator. The footage revealed an unidentified individual prowling the property. This person was deliberately concealing their identity wearing a full face mask to ensure complete anonymity. The timeline begins on the evening of January 31st, 2026. Furthermore, the suspect was carrying a very specific piece of equipment, a large Ozark Trail brand backpack. This was the monster the media had completely missed. A faceless tactical intruder equipped to haul away evidence, or perhaps equipped to subdue a fragile 84-year-old woman. The revelation of the masked figure sent an immediate shockwave of pure terror straight through the local community. The realization that a highly organized and incredibly violent stranger had successfully breached a quiet, residential neighborhood was infinitely more frightening than the false narrative of a family dispute. The authorities also confirmed that the biological material painstakingly extracted from the disturbed crime scene completely corroborated the video footage. The foreign DNA profile isolated by the laboratory absolutely did not match any of the relatives. The science perfectly aligned with the visual evidence to completely exonerate the man who had been dragged through the mud for weeks. The television host who confidently proclaimed his guilt was completely silenced by the undeniable weight of empirical data. It was a seemingly ordinary winter night when Tommaso Cioni pulled his vehicle up to the residence of his mother-in-law, Nancy Guthrie. The man who dropped her off at 9:48 p.m. was never the villain. He was a secondary victim trapped in a horrific nightmare orchestrated by a masked phantom and amplified by a reckless press. The real architect of this tragedy was still walking free, hiding behind an unknown genetic code. We are tracking the progress of that specific DNA sample through the national databases right now, so make sure you hit the notification bell. The moment the laboratory identifies the individual wearing that backpack, we will release an emergency breakdown of their criminal history. The narrative had violently shifted from a domestic drama to a terrifying hunt for a sophisticated predator who was comfortable operating in the shadows and dismantling security systems with clinical precision. The public was forced to confront the chilling reality that the true danger was not sitting on a news broadcast defending himself, but was instead a nameless ghost who had successfully executed a flawless extraction and vanished into the night. The profound whiplash experienced by the public following the sheriff's announcement was immense, but it paled in comparison to the complex reality the family now faced. The clock read exactly 9:48 p.m. By the time April arrived, the visual dynamic of the investigation had completely transformed. According to independent reports, the son-in-law, who was once the primary target of national suspicion, was now openly collaborating with the authorities. He was seen physically walking alongside law enforcement personnel directly into the residence to assist them in their ongoing forensic mapping. This powerful image of cooperation served as the final definitive nail in the coffin of the media-generated conspiracy. It visually cemented the repaired relationship between the grieving relatives and the detectives who were desperately trying to solve the case. However, the official exoneration provided incredibly cold comfort. While his name was completely cleared on every single legal document and police report, the internet is notoriously unforgiving and permanent. The digital footprints of the horrific accusations, the viral video clips labeling him a murderer, and the thousands of hateful comments do not simply vanish when the truth is revealed. He will likely spend the rest of his life dealing with the lingering shadows of a crime he watched her safely approach the house, ensuring the 84-year-old woman was completely secure before he finally pulled away from the curb. Did not commit simply because a journalist needed a compelling hook for a prime-time broadcast. The damage inflicted by the court of public opinion is entirely irreversible. But the most devastating aspect of this resolution is the agonizing lack of closure regarding the central tragedy. The family had successfully fought off the vultures of the press, and their innocence was scientifically proven, but the house remained tragically empty. Defeating a false narrative does not bring a missing mother back through the front door. The masked figure with a heavy backpack had successfully evaded immediate capture. The shattered pieces of the security camera were safely logged in an evidence locker, and the foreign genetic profile was continuously cycling through federal databases, hoping for a sudden algorithmic match. The profound silence from the television networks that originally championed the false accusations was utterly deafening. There were no primetime apology specials and no massive retractions broadcast to millions of viewers. This was not an unusual event or a sudden break in their routine. The journalists simply packed up their cameras and quietly moved on to the next tragic spectacle, leaving the relatives to sweep up the shattered pieces of their reputation alone. This stark reality highlights the deeply parasitic nature of sensationalist broadcasting. They extract the maximum amount of emotional drama from a vulnerable situation and abandon the victims the moment the actual truth becomes legally complicated. The physical absence of the 84-year-old matriarch continues to cast a massive shadow over every single family gathering and every passing holiday. The son-in-law, despite his total vindication, must carry the unique and heavy trauma of knowing that his final act of care, driving her to the door, was weaponized against him by millions of strangers. The detectives continue to monitor the national genetic registries with relentless dedication. They know that the individual who carefully masked their face and purposefully disabled the surveillance equipment is not a first-time offender. A crime executed with that level of specific tactical precision suggests a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern. It was a standard family drop-off, a quiet act of care that had likely happened dozens of times before without any incident. The authorities are entirely confident that the unknown DNA profile belongs to a highly dangerous repeat offender who is likely sitting in another jurisdiction completely unaware that his microscopic signature was left behind in the dirt. The agonizing wait for that scientific connection is a slow psychological torture for the family. They have survived the brutal trial by media, but they are still desperately waiting for the actual trial by jury. What this case teaches us about the weaponization of the true crime media is absolutely critical for anyone actively consuming this specific genre. We must establish a strict and unyielding analytical boundary between exclusionary evidence and incriminating evidence. When local law enforcement seizes a vehicle or demands a baseline genetic sample from an immediate family member, it almost always a vital exclusionary tactic explicitly designed to map out the normal biological environment of the victim. It is a strictly necessary scientific filter required to clean the scene, not a sudden declaration of legal guilt. The widespread failure of the general public to understand this very basic forensic protocol essentially allows, however, in the brutal reality of criminal investigations, this specific mundane action carries a heavy and terrifying weight. Irresponsible media commentators to manipulate standard operating procedures into massive, sinister conspiracies. This specific dynamic creates a highly dangerous and deeply unethical phenomenon known as trial by media. This modern broadcast system actively exploits the legal and scientific blind spots of the viewing audience to generate highly lucrative engagement directly at the expense of an active and fragile investigation. When the digital public sphere becomes overwhelmingly flooded with misdirected anger and fake tips, the actual local investigative apparatus is severely compromised. The police departments are inevitably forced to burn incredibly valuable operational hours managing massive public relations crises rather than analyzing the physical clues left at the perimeter. The ultimate and most terrifying lesson here is that demanding immediate narrative satisfaction during the incredibly chaotic early days of a mysterious disappearance almost mathematically guarantees the public crucifixion of an innocent person. By thoroughly understanding these specific manipulative broadcast tactics, we can collectively refuse to participate in destructive digital witch hunts and demand that the national focus remain strictly anchored to the verifiable forensic science. Within days, law enforcement officers moved silently in the dead of night to seize a vehicle belonging to his wife, hauling it away into the darkness. Why is this exact timestamp so critical for you to understand? The highly complex and incredibly meticulous laboratory analysis of the foreign genetic material remains strictly ongoing as the federal authorities patiently wait for a critical database hit. The calculating individual who violently shattered the security camera and successfully orchestrated this entire devastating nightmare is still out there, potentially hiding in plain sight within the community. The very next time you see a screaming television headline instantly convicting a grieving relative based entirely on anonymous broadcast rumors, you need to immediately remember the seized vehicle and the absolute total vindication of Tommaso Cioni. The actual monster in this specific tragedy was wearing a heavy face mask and carrying a dark Ozark Trail backpack while the entire country was intentionally manipulated into looking the complete opposite way? Will the advancing forensic science eventually catch up to the dangerous phantom captured in the grainy footage, or will his true identity remain permanently locked away in the shadows? Stay extremely vigilant, critically examine absolutely everything you hear on the evening news, and never trust a verdict without physical proof. Because in the world of missing persons cases, the absolute last individual to see the victim alive is automatically thrust into the center of the investigative crosshairs. Click the video currently on your screen to immediately dive into another heavily documented case where the dangerous initial assumptions of local detectives completely destroyed a pristine crime scene and allowed a predator to walk away untouched. They become the primary focal point for every single detective assigned to the case. It does not matter if you are a devoted husband, a loving daughter, or a helpful son-in-law. The moment you become the final entry on a victim's timeline, you are entirely stripped of your benefit of the doubt. Your behavior is scrutinized, your phone records are pulled, and your every movement is dissected by people trained to find lies in the smallest inconsistencies. Tommaso was simply performing a familial duty, but that exact duty placed him at ground zero of a massive forensic hurricane. Law enforcement must operate under the assumption that the closest person might be the most dangerous person until proven otherwise. It is a harsh operational necessity designed to catch domestic abusers and violent relatives quickly. Therefore, the simple act of driving her home transformed Tommaso from a caring family. Almost immediately, a veteran journalist sits under the bright lights of a national television broadcast and boldly declares him the prime suspect to millions of captivated viewers. Member into the ultimate person of interest the very second Nancy was reported missing. He had absolutely no idea that the short drive would become the most heavily analyzed journey of his entire life. When the taillights of his car faded into the dark distance at 9:40, 8 p.m., he truly believed he was leaving her in the safest place possible. He thought the heavy doors and familiar walls of her home would protect her from the outside world. He had no way of knowing that his departure was merely the beginning of a living nightmare. The quiet residential street offered no warnings and no signs of the impending devastation. As he drove back to his own home to his wife Annie, the silence of the night felt entirely normal. But it was not normal. The moment the car door closed and the engine faded away, a terrifying countdown officially started. An unseen threat was already in motion, and the protective bubble surrounding the Guthrie family was about to be violently popped. It is the absolute perfect true crime narrative featuring a familiar villain right inside the family tree. The unease that settled over the empty property was palpable but invisible to the man who had just left. He drove away completely unaware that the very next time his name was spoken, it would be entirely wrapped in suspicion and national scandal. The darkness that swallowed the house after he left hid a secret that would soon destroy his reputation. He was entirely blind to the catastrophic forces gathering around his family. The countdown was silently ticking away, preparing to crush them all. The illusion of safety shattered with devastating speed when Nancy seemingly vanished into thin air. A woman of her age and physical condition does not simply pack a bag and wander off into the horizon without leaving a massive trail of evidence. The immediate realization that she was completely gone sent shockwaves of pure panic straight through the core of the Guthrie family. The initial confusion rapidly morphed into a frantic and desperate search as hours bled into an agonizing day. The local police department descended upon the quiet residence, stringing up bright yellow crime scene tape and establishing a rigid perimeter to lock down any potential clues. The public devours the scandalous story, and the internet quickly forms a relentless digital lynch mob. The atmosphere shifted from a worried family gathering to a highly tense tactical operation. Savannah Guthrie, a widely recognized television host, suddenly found herself on the other side of the breaking news camera. Her face, usually bright and composed on morning television, was now etched with profound grief and righteous anger. Standing before the press, she delivered a raw and desperate plea demanding the public help bring her home. Her voice carried the heavy weight of a daughter who knew her mother was in grave danger. The family was living through an unimaginable hell, trapped in a terrifying limbo where every ringing phone could bring either salvation or absolute devastation. The local authorities immediately recognized the extreme high-profile nature of the case, and the intense pressure to deliver answers quickly began to mount. When a vulnerable person disappears from their own home without any forced entry visible from the street, investigators are trained to look inward before they look outward. They cannot afford to chase phantoms in the woods when a predator might be sitting right inside the living room. The standard operating procedure dictates that you must completely eliminate the inner circle before you can successfully track a stranger. Everyone from casual podcast listeners to amateur sleuths instantly points their fingers at the man who dropped her off. This means every family member, every close friend, and every frequent visitor is subjected to grueling interviews and invasive background checks. The police are not looking for comfort, they are looking for motive, opportunity, and means. To find the invisible monster who dragged an 84-year-old woman out of her sanctuary, the detectives had to systematically tear down the lives of the people who loved her the most. They demanded timelines, they requested access to private communications, and they started asking incredibly uncomfortable questions. Who benefits financially from her disappearance? Was there any hidden tension behind closed doors? Who had the physical strength to move her without alerting the neighbors? The intense scrutiny is an absolutely brutal process for a family already drowning in sorrow. They are forced to defend their innocence while simultaneously begging for help to find their missing matriarch. The investigative net was cast wide, but it was pulled tightest around those who stood nearest to the epicenter of the crime. The circumstantial evidence seems completely undeniable when you watch it rapidly unfold on the evening news. And in this specific tragedy, nobody stood closer to the final known moments of Nancy Guthrie than the man who drove her home. The police needed a starting point, and the timeline provided them with exactly one name. To solve the terrifying mystery of who took her, the authorities had to initiate a ruthless process of elimination from the inside out. And the very first target of that meticulous forensic dissection is always the person who watched the door close. The burden of proof suddenly shifted from finding the kidnapper to proving that the family was not involved. The officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every single door, searching for any witness who might have seen a struggle or a suspicious vehicle. But the silence of the neighbors only amplified the internal focus. The lack of an obvious external breach forced the detectives to double down on their internal strategy. They needed physical leverage to break the case wide open. The tension between the grieving relatives and the relentless investigators created a pressure cooker environment where every word was analyzed and every action was highly suspected. But the most terrifying aspect of this entire case is not just the sudden and heartbreaking disappearance itself. The hunt for the truth had officially begun, but the crosshairs were firmly locked on the family tree. The simmering tension exploded into a full-blown national scandal in early February. While the family was desperately praying for a safe return, the aggressive machinery of the true crime media complex kicked into high gear. Reports suddenly surfaced claiming that law enforcement had quietly moved in and towed away a vehicle belonging to Nancy Guthrie, the wife of Tommaso. The image of a family car being hauled off to a secure police impound lot is incredibly powerful and deeply damaging. It is the visual equivalent of a guilty verdict in the court of public opinion. Before the local police could even release an official statement regarding the vehicle, the narrative was violently hijacked by the national press. Ashley Banfield, a veteran broadcast journalist with a massive audience, dropped an absolute bombshell on live television. Citing an unnamed and unverified law enforcement source, she boldly and unequivocally labeled Tommaso Cioni as the prime suspect in the disappearance of his mother-in-law. The broadcast was a masterclass in sensationalism, utilizing the alleged seizure of the vehicle as the ultimate smoking gun.